Hello and welcome. I am Tamara Ferguson, and I work as an EdTech specialist for Cypress Fairbanks ISD. That is a school district on the outskirts of Houston. As a classroom teacher, my focus was on student-centered learning, and EdTech tools are an important part of supporting that. In my current role, I now work with teachers and coaches, helping them to use technology in ways that effectively support teaching and learning practices. And my priority is still on student-centered learning. Today, I'm going to focus on how you can use Google Forms to create responsive learning opportunities, which can be used to support student-centered learning. Before we get into the how-tos, I know it is important for you to know why you would even consider doing this. How does it serve you as a teacher? How does it serve your students? There has been a ton of talk recently about the learning gaps that the pandemic has created. Yes, that is probably true. But we as teachers know that kids have always had learning gaps, and some would even argue that the pandemic really put that in the spotlight. This lesson today will help us target those students while honoring students who are ready to move on. Specifically, I want to show you how to create individual learning paths for students who need enrichment opportunities or who might be better served with remediation before moving on. Students who master questions will have the opportunity to fast track through assignments and move on to tasks more in line with their learning needs. Not to be overlooked, we can also use the data collected to identify students who need further assistance. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed today's session.
To give you an idea of how this might look, I have an example I'd like to share with you. Before I share the bit.ly so you can access it, let me walk you through what this will look like. To start with, you're going to get a copy where you make your own copy and it goes in your drive. When it opens, I'd like to encourage you to browse through what you see inside that document. To start with, you'll notice that there is a why statement. I'd like to encourage you to make your own why statements for your students because it builds buy-in with your students. If they understand why you're asking them to do with it, they will want to perform to serve your needs, especially when those needs are to help them. And I also have some questions to help identify your students. Notice that I've asked them to identify their last name and their first name. And that's because if you ask students to just write their name or even their full name, they'll give you their first name and then you won't know who they are, especially if you have more than one student with the same last name. And really important if you have multiple classes to identify what period each of those students are in. Then you get into your question, and then you get into the reteaching based on the responses that those students choose. That can include video, text, images, websites, or others. Notice that I also have an alternate question for question number 1. This is your alternate if the students need reteaching, you want to reevaluate whether or not they've learned anything from that reteaching opportunity and the questions that go with it. It's always been my practice to provide feedback right inside the form rather than waiting for the students to submit to get their feedback, whether they get questions right or wrong, for 2 reasons. A lot of times students just look at the score and they don't even look at the feedback in the forms afterwards by clicking on that link. But by giving them this feedback, it doesn't reinforce misconceptions because students might think they have something right and understand something correctly when in fact they don't. So giving them that feedback and encouragement in the same place allows students to want to continue to move on. And then of course the second question. Notice that I'm not on the second question until section 8. And that's because of all the stuff before is in different sections to keep it organized for both you and your students. Once you've browsed through what's inside the form, I'd like you to click on the preview. When you click on the preview, you will enter that information as if you're a student. Go ahead and fill it out a couple times because that will build multiple responses for you to evaluate when you look at the data, but it will also show you the individual pathways that are created. Some considerations to consider when adding content include images. When you're adding images, less text is always going to be better. Let your words let your images be your words for you. And infographics can be a great tool in achieving that. Also, be sure to include pictures that are reference points for your students. Things that you've already used in class when you're reteaching will allow students to remember what was said during the time of the initial instruction. For videos, longer videos are not better for students. Many studies have shown that the shorter video, especially if they're longer videos chunked into separate videos, have increased retention of learning for students. So shorter videos are always better. You can also include things like links to your drive. If there are folders for students to access information for content that were already taught, you can use that as part of your reteaching within your form. You can also have students jump out to websites or even other presentations that might be online. Now, if you're sharing resources, make sure that everything is shareable. Generally speaking, viewable with a link works best, but if it's something that's protected, you can share within your district, but make sure it's viewable for your students. And when you're putting content in there and you have links, you may want to consider creating shortened URLs. There's many resources out there. I'm using Bitly when I'm sharing them with you today. That makes your links inside your document look less messy because some links are really long. They're multiple lines long and they fill up so much space, and it can be distracting from the information you are actually sharing. And lastly, with your questions, if you are assessing this to determine whether students need accelerated or reteaching opportunities, if you have one question per skill for your initial questions, students can guess, and they have a 25% chance of guessing. If you have multiple questions that evaluate that same skill, then guessing opportunities are reduced and you'll have a better evaluation tool as to whether or not a student needs help or whether they guessed and got it right. Now I would like to show you how to create this type of individualized learning form or responsive learning form. So I have a sample that's partially filled. And the reason why that's important for me to point out to you is because this is not a session on how to use Google Forms from scratch. The session is how to take it to the next level. And keep that in mind when I'm going through this information, that there's some things that you may not know about Google Forms, and having resources about getting started with Google Forms is something that I'm going to share with you at the end of the session if you are new to Google Forms. But I'm going on the premise that you're not new to Google Forms and that you're ready to move on to the next level in what you can do more with this tool. Okay, to begin with, you can see I have my why statement and I have my identifier questions. And if I put this in presentation mode, you can see that the why statement and the identifier questions are in the same section. And I'm pointing this out to you because we all know students are great for reading information and reading directions and all the information you want them to read before they start. We all know that, right? Yeah, no, they're not. Your kids are likely to go over this, skip over that, not read it, and start filling in the blanks. To encourage them to not do that, I encourage you to create these in sections. So here's your why statement. If you click on these two, it looks like an equal sign. That actually means creating new sections. So what I have right here, I'm isolating the why statement. So that's the only thing that's going to show up on their screen. When they're done reading that, they're going to click the next button, and that will force them, or maybe not force them, but encourage them to actually read that. So let me show you what that looks like. So here's my why statement. It's the only thing on the page. And because there's nothing else on the page, your students are more likely to read that why statement, then click the next. So I've created one section for my why statement. I've created another section for who are you? And once again, making sure that I put my last name separate from my first name. It helps me sort my data, but it makes it more likely that you'll actually get your student's last name, and then my periods. Then I go on to my questions. Now, after you've done the who are you, that's where I'm going to add my new section for my new question. So I have an untitled question or untitled section. I'm going to delete that out, and here I'm going to write question 1. It's important to label your sections by their questions, especially if you have like 9 or 10 questions that you're going to put in this form, and you'll get lost if you don't. Now I'm going to add my question to it. Now here's a little cheat thing that you might be interested in. It's not really cheating, it just makes it more efficient. If you create a question bank, because Google doesn't allow you to copy and paste questions from other forms, you can create your own bank, allowing you to reuse questions from form to form. So I'm going to do that. Pop my question in the question statement. Then I'm going to do the same thing for my responses. And this is a cool thing. I can highlight all my responses. Notice that I have not labeled them A, B, and C. That's because I'm going to show you something in just a moment that you may also want to consider. Now this is going to be multiple choice and Control V and all my options. And all you have to do in this document right here is just make sure you click enter so there's a space between them. Okay, I do want to click on my 3 dots and make sure that I shuffle my answer choices. And the reason why is that when I create my responses, I always make my first choice. This is just an organization that works for me. My first choice is always going to be the right thing, and you don't want it to be unshuffled because it will always choose the right one. Create my answer key. I know this is my correct choice, and click done. Now my next step is to have students based on my 3 misconceptions. These misconceptions are common misconceptions that students actually have. They are not random answer choices that are wrong. And to make quality responses and feedback for you, make sure you're choosing answers that address common misconceptions. If you're new to teaching or new to your subject area, you may not know what those misconceptions are yet. And therefore, it's important for you to have conversations with your fellow teammates, or if you don't have anybody else in your class or your school that actually teaches the same concept, reaching out in your professional learning communities to see what those misconceptions are. Once you have identified them, you can put them in here, and this makes your data better. So let's say this student right here, I would like to have it go to a section based on an answer. This guy right here, I'm going to be moving him to a different spot. I can show you that in just a moment. I'm going to address my misconceptions first. I'm going to not go to the next section. Now the next section is actually section 4, or actually section 5. And the reason why is if you edit things and it goes to the next section and it's no longer the next section, then your form will go to random places. So instead of doing next section, avoid doing that except for when that's always going to be true. Now, so the next section is section 5. This is section 5, and this is an explanation with a YouTube video. I'm going to repeat it. Now these 2 misconceptions, I can have them go to the same place because they are the same type of misconception. They would also benefit to going to section 5. Now this guy right here has a different misconception, so he is going to go to this spot right here, which is section 6. So I'm going to have him jump down to section 6. Now let's address the right answer. Right now it's going to the next section. Clearly, the next section is reteaching. That's not going to work. So where is my actual question number 2? Well, my actual question number 2 is not till section 9. So I'm going to scroll back up there. And if you label your sections, it actually helps right here. Section 9 is the second section. So I always label my sections, and that's the reason why. It makes it easier to identify what I'm choosing. Now, can you imagine if you had 9 questions and you're trying to figure out what all your sections are? It can be a little cumbersome because right now I literally only have 3 questions in this entire form, and I have like, I don't know, 15 sections in here. You can get lost. So I have a strategy to help you from getting lost, and here's your strategy. Ahead of time, go ahead and make your plan. You can make your plan with a graphic organizer that looks like this on the left, or you can make it through text. I've had teachers type these out electronically or do them by hand. Whatever your comfort level is, choose that. It doesn't really matter as long as it keeps you organized. Let me show you how that works. So I'm going to jump back over here. So I'm using an endless whiteboard, which is a perfect ideal solution for me when I'm creating organization because it allows me to keep moving whatever direction. Now I'm going to put my drawing tools up, and you'll notice I've already laid out my 3 questions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to identify the right answers and the wrong answers. So my first answer choice, just to keep myself organized, is always the first one will be the correct answer. And then the next three, notice I've not labeled them A, B, and C. The reason why I have not labeled them A, B, and C is because they're going to end up being shuffled anyway. So to keep myself organized, I just keep the same pattern, always the same way. Now these ones right here are going to need reteaching. So I'm going to label them reteaching. Now where does the reteaching go at this point? Well, the reteaching, let me make my thing a little bigger so it doesn't look like I'm writing like a 3-year-old. So my reteaching right here for this one could go to the same section as these ones, and that's what we did in our actual form. And this one will be our section that we don't know what it is yet. And then this one right here is going to go to its own reteaching section. From there, these students, let me change my color. I'm going to do purple. And these guys from here are going to go to the alternate, and it's important to label it alternate question number 1, because it's possible that you have multiple alternate questions for number 1, but I need to know that this is my alternate question. It's still related to the same skill. It's the redo question, and I want them to redo a different question because that way it evaluates whether or not they've learned it. And again, this is going to go to its spot, but I haven't figured out what that is yet. And these kids right here, once they've answered these questions correctly, are now ready to go on to question 2. And actually, whether or not they've answered the question correctly or not, they're going to go on to question number 2. So that means I need to identify my section. Let me change my color. And this time I'm going to go to blue. Actually, I'm going to do sparkle. That's sparkle. Indecisive. All right, so this section, what section is this one right here? Well, I'm going to go look at my document that I'm working on, and I always set up my forms the same way, so it's always going to be the same for me. Section 1 is always going to be for me the why statement, and then section 2 for me is always going to be who are you. So for me, always the first question lands in section 3. I keep the same format to make myself always do the same thing, and that allows me to make my job easier when I'm creating these in the future because it's always the same for me. So therefore, my first question does not actually land in section 1. It's going to be section 3. That means the reteaching opportunity is going to be in section 4. The other reteaching opportunity is going to be section 5. And then the alternate question is going to be in section 6. That means question 2 is going to be section 7. And that helps me stay organized. Once again, let me change my color. Move this over here. I'm going to change my color back to, okay, so again, correct, needs reteaching. And maybe these are totally different misconceptions, so I'm going to have each one of them go to their own sections. But all 3 of those will need to go to an alternate question, and this will be alternate for the number 2 question. Okay, changing my color to my sparkly. So that's section 7. That means this is going to be section 8, 9, 10, and section 11. This just helps me organize where things are going to go. So I keep this as a reference. If you're doing it by hand, you can keep it alongside. Okay, so where's this reteaching going in here? I made this video. What section does it go in? You can glance at where it goes. And then your kids can continue on with this right here, ready for question 3. And these guys are ready for question 3. Now, students that get information incorrect for the alternate questions down here, these are where you're going to be doing your reteaching. So you're not creating remediation built in the form for these sections right here. You will identify those students, but make sure that you pull them out later to talk to them because clearly they didn't learn from the reteaching opportunity built inside your form. Okay, so that's how you will create your planning guide ahead of time to keep yourself organized when you are working in there. Once you have planned out your content, added your content, one more thing to consider when you're building your form is the settings. When I click on my settings, yes, you probably want to keep it as a grade. And yes, you probably want to have the feedback immediate because it always helps. But actually, if you look, I provide feedback directly inside my questions. So when I click back over here, you can see that I have feedback already built into my questions right here. And that's an important part of this because when students get their feedback and they click on the submit and they get their score, many students don't look at the feedback that results at the end that you've built in at the end. They look at the score and they move on. And for me, I put the feedback right in the form in a new section, and I find that's much more effective. If you lock your mode, your students will not be able to go to things outside of the form. So if you've linked out to things outside, such as websites, files that you have saved in your drive, you do not want to have this in the locked form. You want to keep it unlocked. There's some other options to include right here. You may also want to consider how many times you want your students to submit. Do you just want one time or make it available to redo? If this is a learning form, then allow your kids to redo the submission as many times as you want. It may make your data a little lumpy, but you would just have to look at their initial response, and that will allow you to identify what needs they have as opposed to redoing the form over and over. So consider that if you want to or not. That's just something to think about. And then, of course, the confirmation message, which is actually going to be under the presentation mode right here. And I always provide information for my students to know what to do next. It eliminates the number of questions you have. What do I do next? I'm done. I'm done. I'm done. You don't have to answer that 20,000 times, maybe just 3 instead, because somebody's not going to read that. But it does reduce the number of questions you have. So now your form is all ready to go. We have shown you how to create responsive forms and how to put your questions in there. The next step is to identify what your students have done when they've submitted. By clicking on the responsive tab, you can actually see at a glance how your students have done. And at a glance, I can see that nobody has these 2 misconceptions of the 12 students that have submitted. And this one is clearly a misconception that has either come as a result of the way I've been teaching or prior knowledge that students already came to me with. And I can keep scrolling through. And you may not have known, but you could also look at this by question and by individual student and see how each student has done. Again, this information is not necessarily useful to get into the inner workings of what's going through the minds of your students. You will need a data spreadsheet. If you're not familiar with data spreadsheets, let me walk you through that. If you've never clicked on, let me click on responses. If you've never clicked on this button before, it will default to creating a new spreadsheet. If you would like to compile your data from multiple forms, you can do that in an existing spreadsheet that allows you to have even a bigger picture of how your students are doing. So if you create a form for multiple days and they're all on the same topic, if you compile them all together, you can see your progress of your students or get a bigger picture. So it's something to consider. Let's jump back to our form right here. And when I click on this button, because I've already set it, it will pop me over to this document right here. Now in this document, this is my spreadsheet with my students. I do get a timestamp, and the importance of that is if your students have multiple submissions, you will be able to identify which their first, second, third, last submission might have been. If you are not requiring students to do multiple or allowing for multiple submissions, then that timestamp may not be useful and you can just minimize it or even hide the whole column itself. Your next score, then you have your last name and your first name. And separating it in the form is helpful here because you don't have to do it in the spreadsheet. I can sort by last name And same with the class periods, I can sort by class period. Generally speaking, they come in based on the time they're done. But if you have absent students, this may not come in order, so you may want to sort it. So let me show you how to sort it. Select your whole column, click on Data, Sort Sheet from A to Z. Will sort your periods in order, and you can do the same thing with the last name if you were taking grades for it. Now, next over here to the right is my question. Question number 1 was required by all students, so therefore they all have a submission. However, the alternate question, this is the alternate question right here. This alternate question is only going to be answered by students who did not have the incorrect answer and who did not have misconceptions. So that's why you have blanks right here. Same thing with question number 2. This is my actual question number 2 right here. And these students only needed to answer it if they had misconceptions and had to retake this question number 2. Now, when you get over here, and I'm looking over here, well, how do I identify misconceptions in here? It's just a lot of text. And normally it comes in like this, and then you're like, well, I really can't see it now. So you could spread it out and do it by hand, but there's actually an easier way of figuring that out, and that's through conditional formatting, where I can color code based on your incorrect answers and correct answers, which allows me to figure out who knows what. So I can do that here, but I can clearly see that I have misconceptions here. So students that have it wrong here cleared an answer here. Students that have it right don't have an answer here. So I don't necessarily need to do the filtering in here, just in the alternate question. Now I could read through these and figure out what's what. Or remember that bank over here? I have the questions right here. Here's my alternate question, and here's my responses. So I'm going to pick one of the misconception responses, right click and copy it, go back to my spreadsheet, and this is the column that I want to do my filtering. I'm going to format, click on conditional formatting, and it defaults to if it's not empty, and it turns it green. Well, that's not what I want. I want to have an exact choice of answer, and in the value spot right here, Control V, that statement from my bank, and I can change the color to whatever I want. I'm going to change it to orange, and done. Nobody picked that answer choice. So that's clearly not a misconception that I need to address. So over here, next choice. Copy, go to my spreadsheet, make sure the column is still highlighted so it knows it's the whole column, and I'm going to add another rule and change it to exact, put my next text in there, and I have some takers. You can see it popped up. I'm going to change the color. Last time I chose orange. This time I'm going to choose a red color and click done. So I have 2 students in the same period that I'm going to work together because they have the same type of misconception, and I have 1 student over here. Jump back over here, and then I have my misconception I'm going to copy, go back to my spreadsheet, make sure my column is highlighted, add another rule, change it with exact, paste that little sucker in, and change my color again because I want to know who has what misconception, so it's important to pick a different color, and click done. So I have nobody with that misconception. I have 3 people and 1 person, and this person, they're in the same period. I will meet with these 2 students and meet with a student individually. Now all the rest of these are students that have clearly understood, well, hopefully they understand and didn't just guess, and that's the benefit of having multiple answers on the same skill. Now when you're done, you may want to also identify students that need to be fast-tracked. So what you can do with that, do you see these blanks right here? What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick this and I'm going to add an additional conditional formatting. And that's going to be, if the cell is empty, it's going to go green. And here's the benefit of that. If I look at an individual student, let's see Rodney Tasty over here, Rodney Tasty. And if I see a whole bunch of green spots all the way through my spreadsheet, clearly Rodney Tasty has mastered this concept, and I may want to make sure, because you don't want kids sitting around doing nothing while you're working with kids in small group instruction, you need to give him something that he's going to work on independently, as maybe an inquiry of another activity or something else that's going to give him enrichment opportunities, or moving on to the next topic, whatever it is, Rodney Tasty, if he's got green all the way through, is going to need something different than the rest of your students that have had reteaching opportunities that need to be put in place in person. Okay, so I'm going to close that out so you can see what I have. So at this point, we have gone through and shown you how to identify students that need reteaching, how to group them in color groups, and how to identify your students that may need some accelerated instruction once they're done this form.
Earlier on in the session, you had a sample where you went through in your form and created some sample submissions. I would like you to open that original form, click on the spreadsheet, and try doing the sorting and the conditional formatting to see how you can use this to identify both the students that need accelerated instruction and students that need additional reteaching.
In summary, we spent time today going over how to create a form that supports acceleration of content when students show mastery, and how to add reteaching opportunities right in a single form. We then showed you how to use that data collected in a spreadsheet to identify students who still need to meet you either individually or in small groups. We covered a lot, but one of the advantages of being virtual means that you could start and stop, back up and pause and check things out on your own, which is a great advantage of being in virtual as opposed to in person. Now, I realize that this was a lot to take in today. I'm also going to share with you a bit.ly, which will allow you to be able to view the information I shared with you today on a site. Let me walk you through that in just a moment. This site goes over everything that we covered today, and as you scroll through, you can see that the videos are embedded with directions as well, and that will help you in your journey when you follow up doing this in a later date. Thank you for being here with me today, and I look forward to perhaps seeing you again next year in TCEA or in one of my other sessions at TCEA. Thank you for joining me.